All right, welcome to our podcast on film genres. This will be a good introduction to you for our next unit where we start to look at some of these film categories. All right, so what is a film genre? Basically, it is a category or type of film. And I think you probably already understand genres better than you think you do, because as you've continued to watch things, you are probably saying to yourself, hi, that looks familiar. I've seen that before. You know, why does the story always end like this? Why does this character always have to do this? Why in an action movie does the bad guy have to come back 10 or 20, 30 times before the good guy can end him? You're kind of like Terminator type thing. And so what you're seeing are the patterns of a film genre. Where did these come from? As we were looking at the studio era, we studied that the studios wanted to put out a bunch of films in as little time as possible. They did their best to find what was successful and then make minor tweaks in that because they were able to create movies a little bit faster. And so the patterns that were successful eventually develop into the genres that we know. And so that's why if you watch pretty much any Western, it's really the same story. You know, some sort of town is in trouble, the lone sheriff or other guy comes to help out, kills the bad guys, usually leaves with the girl, end of story. And so during the studio era, they realized that certain storylines have had great success, so they kept those, tweaked the actors, tweaked some of the storylines, and just kind of were able to put out more movies a little bit faster. But the term of genre wasn't applied until later, so more towards the 1970s, as film historians started looking back on what people were creating. And they realized, hey, there's a lot of patterns here. And I bet if we started to group things together, we would see that large chunks of film had those characteristics that were all very much the same. And so that's where somebody in the 70s looks back and go, hey, these are all these gangster movies, they basically tell the same story, have the same themes, and are shot in a similar manner. Whether they were made by all of one studio or made by many, regardless of which actors were in them, who was directing them, they all started to follow these patterns. And so what are some of the genres? Kind of the big ones are the Western, the gangster film, the musical, and the romantic comedy. There's, depending on which books you read, some will limit it to 4, a couple, maybe 5. Others will have upwards of 10 or 12 different genres. But the point is that these are broad categories that many films can be placed into based on some of the things we're going to look at in a minute. So some of the terms in our study of genre, you'll see the idea of characters. And so as you continue to watch the same genre over and over again, you'll see that actors will play very similar characters from film to film. And so oftentimes we have our hero of the Western who comes in and saves the town, but at the same time they're faced with what we call stock characters. They are the same type of character, have the same depth to them, different names, obviously, different mannerisms, but they are relatively similar to each other. For example, in a Western, we're always going to have some sort of bartender, and we're also going to have some sort of comic relief. If we look at the musical genre, we tend to have a star who has been there for a while, and then somebody who is trying to break into the business. And so those kind of go from film to film within the genre. And a good way to think of this is to think of reality TV, which is casted. They do have auditions. They want to see, who's got a great personality. But if you watch enough of them, you realize the patterns of the casting are pretty similar from show to show, regardless of network or what type of things that are going on. Usually they want somebody who's a little emotionally unstable. They probably want somebody who's going to be racist. They probably want somebody who's gay. And they like to take that whole mix of people and put them in a room and say, be yourselves. And so you can see those same patterns of characters today. And so as we look at genre, what the thing we kind of get to at the deepest part of these films is the themes that they share about the world. For example, in the Western, we tend to see the idea of individualism, where one person can come back and save a town from the bad guy, and also the idea of the end of the frontier, because many of these westerns deal with the time kind of between 1870 and 1900, give or take, kind of the cowboy western time, where we're seeing the end of the Native American culture as white Europeans continue to move west. In the detective genre, the theme that usually comes out is that the world is pretty bad. People are looking for a shortcut, people are looking to lie, steal, and cheat, that kind of stuff, and the detective is the last holdout against that negative world. Another big thing you see with genre is the idea of iconography, and these are the repeated images throughout films in a genre. And so we'll study a couple of these genres in specific, but again, the one that comes back a lot is the Western. You're going to see images of the cowboy hat, the sheriff, the gun as revolver. Oftentimes there's a bar scene. The good guy wears white, bad guy wears black, that kind of stuff. And so regardless of when it was made, whether it was 1940s, 50s, 60s, even some of the movies that are coming out today, you can see that same pattern of iconography within that genre. Another part of the genre is the mood or the emotional setting of that genre, and this kind of goes with the theme, that westerns tend to be kind of depressing because it's the end of the frontier, but there are some uplifting moments when you get the ability for the individual to make a difference. Science fiction, I think you could probably classify that as, somewhat nervous of the future, in that, we don't know what's out there. We have some ideas of what our science and technology can make. But I think what you see in a lot of these sci-fi movies is that technology goes wrong. And specific things like 2001, A Space Odyssey, where basically the computer takes over the ship, or the whole Aliens series, where there's some futuristic being thing out there and ends up killing all the crew. That kind of ties in mood and theme within a genre. Then this part's pretty important, just the cinematic style. And so that is how the genre is shot on film. For example, most westerns are going to have these sweeping, long, establishing shots so that you can see the West, so you can see the cactus and tumbleweeds and things like that. They're mostly going to be shot in the daytime, because when the genre was established, they had to shoot in the daytime. They didn't have a lot of ability to make night into day with lighting and things like that. Whereas science fiction is going to be possibly more at night, obviously in the future, oftentimes on different planets, a lot probably faster editing on those, just to show the parallel between the new technology that the film was talking about and also just the new technology that had developed with the cameras and such. But the one that stands out the most is probably the detective genre and the idea of film noir, and that's something we'll look at individually, where film noir literally means film black, so it's kind of a dark film. And so these detective movies are themselves pretty dark in terms of themes and mood, but also in the way they're shot. A lot of heavy shadows, a lot of low-key lighting, very steep angles, high and low angles, putting characters in the corner, that kind of stuff to show us how the hemmed-in bad guy feels, that kind of stuff. And so as you see these individual genres, you will start to notice the patterns in terms of how they're shot. And that's kind of the purpose of this class, and seeing the cinematic similarities and differences across genres. And what's cool about genres is that they change, and they develop and grow, and they go through different stages. And so the first stage of a genre is what we call the primitive stage. And so this is where everything is just established. The very first cowboy movie would be considered that primitive genre there. So since there was nothing for them to pull on, they were able to tell their story as they wanted, and they kind of started the ball rolling in that genre. Then we have the classical level of genre, where the patterns continue. That type of movie becomes very popular, and that last part there, the basic values are solidified. So we see the pattern developing for cowboy sheriff as hero. Then we move into the revisionist stage of the genre, where The iconography is going to be similar. So in a Western, you're still going to see sheriffs and cowboys and hats and guns and things like that. But some of the values that were in that first genre, the first stages, are questioned. And so maybe the individual can affect change. Maybe the bad guys are too good. So we start to see them question that and start to have some more subtle changes. Eventually we get to the parodic or the parody stage of the genre where filmmakers start to make fun of it. And so some of the themes might be there, the iconography is going to be there, the stock characters are going to be over embellished. So in a Western where you have that comic relief character, now the comic relief character is going to play a bigger role. So maybe in the primitive genre there was just kind of a funny character that would be on screen for a couple of minutes. Now that comedic character is going to be on there 80% of the time. And so we'll talk about some specifics here in a second. And then eventually we get to the extension stage where they take the ideas, themes, and values, but then a lot of parts of the genre change. And so the iconography of gun revolver in the Western might be exchanged for a laser blaster gun type thing in the future. And so we'll see some examples of those coming up. So we've been talking about the Western as a genre that has gone through all the stages, and you can see here those specifics. The primitive stage, the Great Train Robbery, one of the first movies that had cowboys in it, that kind of thing. The classical view of that would be Stagecoach with John Wayne, and then we look at the Wild Bunch coming on a little bit later. And then the parodic stage of that, the one that might be most familiar with people, or people might be familiar with, would be Blazing Saddles, where they take that idea of, lone person coming to save the town, but then they turn that completely on its head and just make fun of everything in there. And then the extension of that genre might be Blade Runner or Star Wars, and that's episode 4 of Star Wars, so not the newer prequels that they made, but the original Star Wars there. And you can see, if you study that a little bit more closely, which we're going to do in class, you can see that a lot of the themes of the original Western maintain themselves. Iconography is there, although it's changed. And so it's not as set in the far west, but it is still a new frontier. This new frontier, though, is now space. And you'll see a lot of those same characters in Stagecoach repeated in Star Wars, but twists. And so as we look at films today, current movies don't fit into one genre. Aside from True Grit that came out this past year, we don't get a lot of pure Westerns. See movies that are trying to break from those patterns, and most of our movies these days do break from all these patterns because individuality really sells a lot better than just the stock canned genre films. But you will see a lot of overlap between things. Shutter Island came out a couple of years ago, and that kind of follows parts of the horror genre, what's going to happen around the dark corner type thing, but also some of the detective genre ideas, and just its style is kind of film noir back to the 1940s. And so that's probably more the norm of today's movies, that they don't fit into a genre, but there are elements of each. And so I think being well versed in some of the major ones will allow you to see where they've grown and changed into today's movies.